Oh boy, if you know anything about the music I talk about, you realize it fits snugly in the bizarre category. When I dissect certain Jandek songs, it's as if I'm exploring a new continent, and when I'm dealing with its natives, sometimes I feel like a misunderstanding could cause me trouble. But that's part of the fun. On the internet, many Jandek songs had never been talked about by the time I started the reviews, whether that's because they're forgettable or fans don't know how to comment on such weirdness. Luckily, I believe today's record is more a case of the latter, and I have always valued it for that reason. This is Somebody in the Snow, which I am ironically reviewing as spring begins. Without question, most of the album is not for the newer fans, and it's usually not one of the first ones they hear about, since it is overshadowed by the last four. You might recall my previous review where I hinted that the song Crazy is a segue to Somebody in the Snow. But exactly how much of this record resembles the end of The Living End? Well, let's just say the genre of crazy matches the first four songs, while the title Crazy applies to the other 10. Part of that is because Jandek is flying solo for the second half, which means no more warm female vocals or blues riffs. That may not seem unusual, but it only scratches the surface. First, there is a very clear intro to the weird stuff, at which point I like to say, the acid is kicking in. Second, the multi-tracked vocals of Interstellar Discussion are back. Third, there is a small section with atonal acoustic guitar, except Jandek saw fit to add some sloppy drumming to the mix. Out of all the classic Jandek songs, that results in one of the most awkward setups you'll ever hear, although it only lasts for 3 tracks. Now, if you're eager to find a guaranteed highlight, just stay for the first 2 songs. However, fans probably disagree on which of the later tracks is best, so I actually don't recommend skipping anything. For now, let's pick up where The Living End left off. Tell Me Who You Are gets the ball rolling in a cool way when Jandek says alright 5 times. I wonder if Outkast heard this when they were writing Hey Ya? The intro might give the illusion that this will be a soothing record, and for the moment, it really is. I won't even bother explaining the guitar chords, since they are on the jazzy side, but if you've heard I Had a Dream by Daniel Johnston, it's kind of like the verses in that. Hell, Jandek even says I had a dream 4 times.
I had a dream, came to me twice. I had a dream, came to me twice.
That's really the topic of this song. Jandek is sharing a pleasant dream he had about Pat, while Pat had a nightmare that she's reluctant to talk about. We do hear the title halfway through, but the context is rather unclear. Either he wants to know her better, or he's really dreaming about a complete stranger. The ending is another mysterious one, at least on the version I've heard. They discuss an orange thing that was lost, and Pat gets cut off mid-sentence. I think I'm used to that at this point, so I have no complaints about this track. I would be delighted to hear it in my own dreams, so maybe I'll try putting it on repeat before I fall asleep. Jandek steps away from the mic for Come Through With a Smile. Since this is in E minor, and it progresses in a similar way, I think of it as a sort of electric cousin of Your Other Man, which is definitely not a bad thing. It's also this album's longest track, taking all that time to showcase Pat at her finest, along with some impressive lead guitar. However, I'm not sure where I stand on the lyrics. A lot of them don't make much sense to me, but the part with "we've got our own style, we've got our own mind" tells you everything you need to know about this group. Also, I always look forward to the ending where Pat keeps saying, "never coming back," even though she can be heard a few more times later on. Overall, this has usually been my favorite song on the album, but now I think I like the first 2 equally. Meanwhile, the next 2 are more modest. I May Not Be Around piggybacks off the last one, although it's a bit faster and heavier on the drums. There's not much to say about the lyrics, but that's fine with me since this track seems to be for the album's sake. The same goes for the instrumental known as Pastimes. It's a pretty calm electric jam, except for when the drumming intensifies in the last minute. In the intro, note the quick little nod to the song Lavender, along with rhythm guitar that will return in a big way on the next record. Like I suggested earlier, track 5 is where the acid kicks in. Om was actually the first Jandek song I uploaded back in July 2015, and I was really surprised nobody beat me to it. Why is it that I rarely hear about this one? Well, it's what the nostalgia critic would call a big-lipped alligator moment. That means it comes out of nowhere, has nothing to do with the rest of the album, and after we hear it, we don't speak of it again. True, there might have been other Jandek songs like that, but Om is the one I always think of. You can find out all you need to know about it by reading the title, but I'll explain just for the fun of it. This is a cappella music with at least 2 vocalists, and there might be some multi-tracking in there. Don't expect any lyrics, this is meditation music, and I have used it for that purpose. Also, if you've ever seen 2001: A Space Odyssey, you can hear similar music at the part where the apes discover the monolith. It might not seem like I'm going in depth, but there's honestly not much to know about Om. It stands as one of the most extreme oddities in the history of Jandek, which is really saying something. Turns out this part of the album starts with 2 good tracks in a row. When I saw the title Bring It in a Manger, I expected a nativity song, because I had never heard of mangers in any other context. Sure enough, Seth Tissue calls it a Christmas song, but is there any truth to that? Well, the lyrics describe someone giving birth, except there's nothing here you would put on the lawn for Christmas. By wasted, Jandek either means the woman is drunk or weakened, and instead of farm animals, there are vultures gathering around. Among all the other nonsense, there is the immortal line, "Give him my genitals in a paper cup," which does not sound Christian, but it might have made sense if Jandek was the Messiah. Underneath it all is what sounds to me like harmonica accompaniment, although others hear some kind of accordion, while the hushed chanting in the background is the cherry on top. Even by Jandek standards, this is still pretty out there, and I love it. Compared to what we just heard, Walking Around is fairly conventional. It is yet another 12-bar blues, you guessed it, in the key of A. But what makes it interesting are the guitars. Basically, they're both rhythm and lead at the same time, except one of them is nothing but high notes, while the other is your usual blues shuffle. Meanwhile, this is the last Jandek song to feature Pat on vocals. Unfortunately, other than a reference to the Tower of Babel, the lyrics of her swan song are rather forgettable. But what is not forgettable is the aforementioned acoustic section, which starts with Sense of Reason. For some reason, it begins with Jandek saying, "Jesus, I can't wait forever," before he sings to his ex, who he didn't fully appreciate until he lost her. In the closing lyrics, I can understand him losing his sense of time and reason, but sense of motion? As usual, we have to use our imagination. While I'm just starting to enjoy this track, I've always preferred the next one, partially because I covered it before I even heard it. Of course, my version of Remind You was missing the most important aspect of the song, which is the use of multi-tracked vocals in separate audio channels. Jandek uses this recording technique to make it sound like he's having a conversation with himself, and the idea of Jandek sharing a studio with his clone is just hysterical. I would say the voice on the right is a bit more reserved, though. As for lyrics, any fan of Quinn Boys will recognize the Bowery and Beacon Hill reference, so you could argue this is a sequel to that song. The conversation between the Jandeks is hard to follow, but I think the one on the left is a vagrant, while the right is someone a bit wealthier. The lyrics start with the latter, who seems to be a gambler, and the Kodak camera in his head sounds to me like counting cards. I love that left Jandek has no clue where right Jandek puts his laundry.
Where you put your laundry, I ain't never been. All I got's my shoes. They took me where I've been.
I don't know how these guys relate to each other, But who says I need to? Also, the guitar is plucked, so it's a nice complement to the other acoustic songs. If you can only take one track from the album's second half, Remind You should do just fine, but I still say listen to everything else first. Tracks 10 to 14 are rather mysterious to me. The last acoustic song is Corner of the Street, which is about Jandek's famous friend who has a bargain basement, while the next section is more reminiscent of albums like The Rocks Crumble and Telegraph Melts. It starts with Stick With Me, aka the Stevens song. If you have a friend by that name, now you have a way to annoy him, especially with those uninspired rhymes in the beginning. I could see this song becoming a meme, but it's not my favorite. I don't have much to say about the last two electric songs, but something else stands out. It's what I like to call Jandek Rapes a Harmonica, although you might know it as You Sing a Song. Sometimes I give it a listen just because of how frantically Jandek blows that thing, and the drumming just completes the awkward experience. The lyrics themselves are a mess, but what gives the song character is the way Jandek mumbles and punctuates them with his breath. It's no masterpiece, but it's a fitting penultimate track for this record, even though I would prefer it at the very end. It's one thing to have this strange musical mishmash we just discussed, but I think it's the graceful opening tracks that make people unsure what to think of it all. This album was released sometime in 1990, and the way it progresses is very much like any new decade would. The 80s lived on for a little bit, but it wasn't long before the good, bad, and especially bizarre were seen as properties of the 90s. Somebody in the Snow may encapsulate the human condition, but it's hard to say whether it foreshadowed anything in the Jandek condition. The magnitude of its weirdness would be matched later in the decade, but the nature of it is another story. You may say you listen to Jandek for how unique he is, but playing this album will perfectly gauge your commitment to that. It may take a few listens, but I definitely consider it essential listening.